story told by Joseph Awuzie. Reverend Awuzie is the director of mission for our New York Annual Conference. And he was born and raised in Ghana and only moved to this country as an adult. He talked about being 14 years old and being sent away to a boarding school. This was a tremendous opportunity for him. And before he left, his mother said to him, if there's anything you need, don't forget, pray to God. If you need anything, pray to God. And so Joseph tells the story that he had only been at school for maybe a week or so, and he lost his towel. Right, so he didn't have a towel to dry himself off with after he took a shower. And he wasn't really sure what to do, and then he remembered his mother's words, if you need anything, you pray to God. And so he just prayed to God, I lost my towel, I need a towel. And he says the next morning, the towel was there, back in his room. And then not too long after that, his alarm clock was broken. He couldn't get it to work properly. And he said, these boarding schools are so strict. You don't want to even think about sleeping in a minute late. It's just not an option. So he was very nervous and very anxious about what would happen if he didn't wake up on time at 5:30 the next morning. He wasn't really sure what to do. He prayed to God. I don't know what to do. I need to make sure I wake up at 5:30. I don't have an alarm clock. I'm supposed to be responsible for myself. I'm not sure what to do. So he just asked God for help. And you know what time he woke up the next morning? 5:30. He got up on time. And he said, okay, fast forward a few decades. He's been living in the United States for a long time. Now, if he were to lose his towel, he probably wouldn't even notice because he has about 10 more in his closet. If his alarm clock were to break, he'd just go buy a new one. He wouldn't really even put God into the equation. He calls his sheep by name. The sheep follow him because they know his voice. Who was here at Rising Hope Sunday a couple of weeks ago and heard our guest preacher, Benny Custodio, very powerful story. He talked about being a lost sheep. And the things that made him lost were dramatic, right? He was lost because of heroin, because of gang life, because of living in a society that didn't value him, that saw him as pretty much disposable, and then entering a prison system that certainly didn't value him as a human being. We talked about all of those things that made him a lost sheep. I'm just thinking about that, and I thought, those things can be a little easier to recognize. Certainly a drug addiction. It's easy to recognize when someone is lost due to something like that. But there are other ways that we can be lost sheep who've forgotten what the voice of our shepherd sounds like. There are ways that are more subtle, a little more sneaky, even insidious. Most of us who live in this part of the country, this part of the state, this part of the county, most of us, we have lots of padding, if you will. We have a lot of insulation that separates us from God. That separates us from our neighbors. When we need something, we have enough of this. We can go out and get what we need. And we're comfortable enough, and we even have such good health care even, that if we have some kind of a health crisis, we kind of forget that the whole reason that we're here in this world is because of God. It becomes easier, the more padding we have, to forget that God's the reason we exist, that we depend on God for our very being. So the first scripture lesson from Acts chapter 2. I had an interesting experience with that. I don't know if you noticed, but a lot of times the cover of the bulletin, the image will match the theme of worship for that week or the scripture lesson for that week. And so I was doing, and it's pretty easy to find them, really. You just enter the scripture passage and do an image search, and you can come up with some pretty good images. I did an image search for this passage from Acts, and I couldn't come up with anything. It was a lot of words, and it's interesting, you know, I put Acts, the whole passage, Acts 2, 42 through 47. And it's interesting the verses that people seem to choose when they're representing this passage from Acts. They choose things like praising God, spending much time together in the temple, day by day the Lord adding to the number who were saved, the apostles doing signs and wonders. Those were all the verses that people seemed to hone in on when they were creating images for this scripture passage. And you know what verses just didn't get any treatment at all? These. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all, as any had need. I didn't find that at all. People just kind of wanted to go, oh, I don't hear that part. Now, those are a couple of verses, right, that liberals love to try to foil biblical fundamentalists with, right? They're the ultimate proof text. Like, you can't be a literalist because if you were, then you would be following these verses, right? You're not really a literalist if you say you are. You're supposed to sell everything that you have and give it to all who have need. I mean, these are a favorite couple of verses. But the thing is, usually the people who are saying this to try to foil their opponent, they're not doing it either. They're not selling everything that they have and giving to all as they have need. That's a tough value to follow, is it not? When you hear verses like this from Scripture, it's easy to just kind of dismiss them and say that's unrealistic. That was a different time. That was a different context. It's not something that we could really follow here and now. And to a large extent, that's true. I mean, everything in our structure and the way that we live now goes against that value, right, of having things in common and sharing with anyone who has need. I mean, just look at our street down here. We're the only family who spends any time on our front porch. You know, people look at us like we're an oddity when we're out on the front porch. I mean, and think about entertainment. You know, it's gone from going to a theater where you share this experience with a huge group of people. It's evolved from that to your living room where you sit around a TV as your isolated nuclear family unit. It's evolved from that to each of us on our own little screens. If you look at 5 houses on any street around where we live, you'll probably find 5 different grills, snow blowers, lawn mowers, hedge trimmers, things that we don't have to use all the time that we can easily share with even just a couple of neighbors. Think how great that would be to just share the burden of maintaining equipment like that. But no, we each have our own little thing. We're each sheltered in our own little environment, surrounded by our comforts, isolated by our comforts. I know that feeling of isolation when I first divorced and then became a single parent. My family they were all halfway across the country. I hadn't lived in my neighborhood for that long. And I would just look around and I would think about those words that unfortunately have become a political football, but these words are true. It takes a village to raise a child. Right? It really does. And I would be there in my house with my kids, and it was just me, and I would say, where is my village? I want my village. And I realized that we have to create it. We're not built as villages anymore. That's why those verses from Acts 2 didn't pop up. We're not structured to live that way. If we're going to live that way, we have to really go against the grain. think it's worth it. I think about some time that I spent in Africa. It was not Ghana, it was Kenya, and a place called Meru. And I was there with a group of college students, and we were working on various construction projects for a seminary there. And when I say construction projects, I mean, we were using the hood of an old VW Bug as our wheelbarrow, and people were using newspaper for work boots, to cover up their feet with. So it was not anything really, really complicated. But for this entire area, the seminary students and then the people who supported the seminary, for all of these people, maybe 100 people, there was one television set. And so every night after dinner, we would all gather in the cafeteria and we would watch soccer or these awful Mexican soap operas. It was just terrible TV. But I look at them and I think about how we would talk about what we had seen the next morning at breakfast, and just be there together as a community. And I compare that to this street here with these beautiful homes and our own individual lives. And I ask myself, who's richer? Who actually is wealthier? Who has a better quality of life? Joseph Iwudzi was a witness to how easily and quickly we start to forget what the voice of our shepherd sounds like. How easy it is to isolate and to buy into that myth, that idolatry, that we are self-sufficient. And so, I know it's hard. I know the idea of not having your own stuff and the idea of just sharing with anyone what they might need. It's very hard to think about living that way, is it not? And it's scary too, because you can think that you could be taken advantage of, right? That someone might not really need what they're saying they need. Right? So I know all of these things. I know how hard it is, and that's why